Welcome to part 4 of JFK and the Civil Rights Movement. Now we're going to take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. By 1962, the Kennedy administration had become increasingly concerned that the USSR was channeling weapons into Cuba, potentially even nuclear weapons. In September of 1962, Kennedy warned the Soviets that the gravest issues would arise should they place offensive weapons in Cuba. Right? Now, the CIA was reporting to Kennedy, hey, we think they're putting nuclear weapons there. But Kennedy was not impressed. He remembers what happened with the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was largely a fiasco because the CIA intelligence was so horrible. You know, the CIA had told Kennedy, the people don't want Castro. We get these exiles in there, they'll rise up. Well, that never happened, right? So he tells the CIA this time, goes, you need to prove it. So they say, well, you need to authorize U-2 flights over Cuba then. And so he does. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba is going to spot several of many offensive ballistic missile sites there, right? They'll return photo data like the one you see here to JFK. In audio recordings of the conversations on this, JFK will ask the CIA analyst, he says, is this like what you're seeing in the Soviet Union? And they'll respond, no, sir, this is actually top of the line stuff. This is more advanced than the stuff we typically see in the Soviet Union itself. This is going to begin a 13-day standoff in which the United States and the Soviet Union are going to balance on just the edge of a full-out global nuclear war, right? On October 16th, Kennedy is going to be discussing the situation with his advisors, and almost all of his advisors are going to agree that maybe the best way to handle this is just a surprise attack on Cuba. Why don't we just go in there? We'll just destroy the sites. I mean, you can't set off a nuclear weapon by blowing it up. That's not how that works. But Kennedy's a little bit concerned with that. One of the things that stuck out with him when he was looking at the intel was soccer fields. At some of these sites, they had built soccer fields. Now, I know that doesn't seem like much, but that's not really a Cuban national sport. Cubans play baseball, right? He says, you know, it doesn't make any sense for the Soviets to give them this kind of offensive nuclear capacity and then just toss them the keys, right? There has to be Soviet units, Soviet troops that actually run these sites. He's right. He doesn't know this, but there's over 40,000 Soviet troops in Cuba at this time manning these sites. Had they gone in there and then just wiped the sites out by bombing them, they would have definitely killed thousands of Soviet troops, which would have been an escalation and probably a full-out nuclear war. On October 18th, the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Lionel Thompson, is going to suggest to Kennedy, maybe what you need to do is just blockade Cuba. Now, a blockade is kind of problematic as well, though, because a naval blockade is actually an act of war. So what Kennedy decides to do is he's going to blockade Cuba, but he's not going to call it a blockade. On October 22nd, 1962, he calls for a quarantine of Cuba, right? What's the difference between this quarantine and a blockade? The word, that's it. The connotation. A blockade is an aggressive, warlike act, but a quarantine is what you do when you're trying to isolate something. Apparently, Cuba has come down with a bad case of nuclear weapons, and we need to quarantine it until it gets better, right? He also warned the Soviets that any missiles launched from Cuba would result in a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. If any missiles get launched from Cuba, we're going to nuke you, right? The naval blockade is going to consist of some 40 U.S. ships and 20,000 men. You're going to have Russian ships heading that way. You're going to have, matter of fact, here, this is where we're really going to get close to a full nuclear conflict. There's going to be Soviet submarines in the area that are going to be shadowed by American destroyers. Every Soviet submarine had a single nuclear-tipped torpedo upon it, but it could only be launched if you had the full agreement of the commanding officer of the ship, the executive officer of the ship, and the political officer of the ship. Every naval ship in the Soviet Navy required to have a member of the Communist Party aboard the ship as a political officer. Okay. one of these submarines could not get in contact with Moscow, which was, according to protocol, meant that they had to assume Moscow had been destroyed, and therefore they were at war. They're being shadowed by this destroyer. They need to surface to try and contact Moscow and to try and recharge their batteries. They're not a nuclear submarine, right? Nuclear engine, anyways. And so they have to make a choice. Do you destroy that destroyer so you can surface? Or do you surface and hope that that destroyer doesn't destroy you because you're actually at war? 2 of the 3 men did sign off on using the nuclear torpedo, but one of them, the political officer, said, no, we're not going to do that. And that's how close it came to a nuclear war. Finally, on the 26th of October, Nikita Khrushchev is going to send a coded cable to Kennedy through Vienna that's going to offer the withdrawal of the missiles from Cuba in return for a pledge by the United States not to try and get rid of the Castro regime, right? Like, it's going to be, that Castro needs to be left alone and we'll get the missiles out of there. That's the secret agreement sent by Khrushchev. Before Kennedy can even respond to this, Khrushchev will deliver a public message saying that he's agreed to ensure that there are no nuclear missiles in Cuba, and in exchange, Kennedy will need to remove the likewise missiles that he has based, that the U.S. has based in Turkey, right? Now, Kennedy's like, well, wait a minute. That wasn't part of the secret cable, right? So the secret cable and the public announcement are completely different. So what does Kennedy do? He needs to end this crisis, but at the same time, especially after the Bay of Pigs, he needs to make sure he saves face. So what he does is he publicly agrees to the private message. He publicly agrees, I have agreed to Khrushchev's proposal that we will leave Cuba alone and he'll get the nuclear weapons out. And then he sent a private message to Khrushchev that said, and we'll remove the missiles from Turkey, which were already obsolete and already planned to be removed and weren't being planned on being replaced. So he doesn't really lose anything out of this, but he also saves face. Now, the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis is pretty profound. Now, first of all, yes, it did solidify the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba that's going to remain strong until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? But both sides, the United States and Russia, both collectively did a kind of, wow, that was really close, right? And so they began looking at some of the things that went terribly wrong during this crisis. First of all, communication. It wasn't very easy for these two sides to communicate with each other. You know, they were sending cables through Vienna and through different ministers here and there. And so what they did was this resulted in the establishment of the red phone, the hotline, a direct line between the Soviet Union and the United States. Still exists today. So Donald Trump could prank call Putin right now if he wanted to, like try and order pizza on it or something, right? The next thing that it also did was by 1963, you're going to have a negotiated treaty concerning nuclear arms, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban of 1963. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban is going to outlaw all atmospheric, space, and underwater testing of nuclear weapons. That means that all nuclear testing from this point forward by the United States and Soviet Union are going to be conducted underground. It's the beginning of the underground nuclear test program. For Khrushchev, a lot of damage was done to his status in the Politburo in the Soviet Union itself. Matter of fact, almost a year to the day from the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis, on October 14th, 1964, the Politburo will remove Khrushchev from power and replace him with Leonid Brezhnev.